Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Tank Talk podcast. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being part of the number one podcast on the face of this earth and all earths just like it in other universes. We have got an outstanding episode for you today, one I've been wanting to do for so long, and John was super excited about it. John, what are we excited about today?
We're going to talk about that organization that everyone has heard of, but probably doesn't know a whole lot about. But they should know a lot about this organization. And that's why we're doing this, to create awareness and make people aware of what's going on out there. Because this company, or this organization, Project Piaba, is doing amazing things. We have Jackie Anderson with us today. She is our guest, and she is with Project Piaba. Her and Jason are going to tell you everything you need to know about this organization. I'm excited to sit back and listen.
Well, Jackie, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate you taking some time. I know you're super, super busy. You guys have a lot going on. I thought it'd be pretty awesome if you could just introduce yourself. Tell us, kind of give us a brief background of what is Project Piaba? How did it start? Where is it at now?
Sure. So I'm Jackie. I'm the executive, or I'm the director of outreach for Project Piaba, and we have been working with the aquarium fish fisheries of the Rio Negro region in Brazil since the early 1990s. And originally it was sort of a scary situation. Like, people were afraid of how many fish were being caught from that particular region of the world and brought into the aquarium fish trade. So people were afraid that it might be unsustainable because it was such a large number of fish that were being harvested every year. Because back at that time, that was the only source of cardinal tetras. This was before they were ever aquacultured or tank raised or anything. So it started out as a, oh my gosh, this is scary. And then it quickly turned into a, after we did a lot of research about the life histories of the fish and the history of the aquarium fishery, and talked with some people and got a couple of years of science underneath the belt of the project, it came out that the fishery is actually incredibly sustainable from a fisheries management standpoint, because the fish populations are linked to rising and falling water levels in the rivers themselves. And that actually provides for fish that basically don't count against next year's amount of fish, right? So if you catch the fish as the water levels are dropping, and those fish are going to get trapped up in these puddles in the flooded forest, those fish aren't going to make it to next year anyway. So catching those fish for the aquarium fish trade actually has a positive impact on the environment, because instead of doing slash and burn farming, timber harvest, gold mining, and all those other things that are destructive for the Amazon, those the people who are engaged in the aquarium fish fishery are aware of how delicate these pretty little fish are that we like in our fish tanks. And so they protect the environment, because the fish is how they make their living, and they know that those fish don't exist without some environmental protection. So they're like the ultimate stewards of the environment, because their livelihood depends on those fish. So after a couple of years of learning that, it sort of pivoted from being a project to research the fish populations and the fishery, and to sort of help it grow and compete in a global market, because now you can buy a cardinal tetra from anywhere in the world, and many of those species that for years and years and years were only available as wild caught fish are now aquacultured in other parts of the world. So now there's competition in the market where there wasn't for many decades. And so part of it is sort of a marketing project of getting people to realize what a positive impact they can have on these biologically sensitive areas where the fish come from, and realizing that we don't live in a bubble. Like, anyone that has a fish tank is connected to this environment, and you're spending your money and you're putting your money in a particular product that has an impact on the environment where it comes from, and the people and the communities and everything like that. So it's actually a really important project that we as fish keepers are directly related to.
That is awesome. That is an awesome summary. How did you get started with Project Piaba? I mean, have you always been there, or when did you come on board?
I came on board kind of, I just sort of fell into it, is probably the best way to describe it. But I started working with Project Piaba, or volunteering with Project Piaba, in probably around 2009 or so, 2008 maybe. So I worked with the gentleman who was our executive director, Scott Dowd, and he and I worked together, and we're both kind of like fish enthusiasts and fish geeks, and we were in the Boston Aquarium Society together, and you know, were generally fishy near each other. And he was like, "Oh, I've got this project. You should check it out." And then I was like, "Oh yeah, I like that project." And so I just kind of wouldn't leave him alone. And every time I'd walk by his desk, I'd be like, "What are you working on? Let me insert myself into this." And and so I sort of got involved in a storytelling capacity. So like I do a lot of the fish conventions, the YouTube channel, the Facebook page, the Instagram, and the stuff like that, which is funny because those are not things that I've ever like, you know, done before in my real life. Like I'm not a social media, like I can barely figure out I can barely figure out social media, but we had a number of interns who were like, "Oh yeah, let me show you how Instagram works. This is a hashtag." And I'm like, "Oh cool." Thanks. So I kind of got involved that way, sort of sideways. But at the time I was also working, so at the time when I met Scott, our executive director, and started getting involved in the project, I was also working a second job at a fish store. And just about everybody that came into the fish store, I like as soon as I found out about Project Piaba, I would be like, "Ooh, don't you want to buy a cardinal tetra?" And I felt like I was like, you know, the Jehovah's Witness of fish. I was like, "Oh, have you heard the story about cardinal tetras? They're really great. They're beautiful. They're so much prettier than neon tetras. Don't you want to talk about them?" And people would be like, "Oh yeah, actually I do see the difference now. I never thought about it. But yeah, they're brighter. The red's brighter. There's more of it. It's what's not to love." And then I would be like, "If you could choose where this fish comes from when you buy it, would you buy one that was caught in the wild, or would you buy one that was farmed on a farm?" And 100% of the people that I talked to said, "Well, I want the farm raised one." And I was like, "Okay, why?" And 100% of those people said, "Because I care about the environment." And I was like, aha. This is sort of a counterintuitive thing, because if you think about it, there are so many people like that live in the Amazon where these fish come from, and it's not something that you think about all the time is the people living in the Amazon, right? A lot of times you think about save the rainforest or save the Amazon, and you're thinking about it as being a place with just trees, and there's people walking down the hallway, sorry. um, just trees and forest and things like that. But it's a place where people live, and a place where people have families and communities, and they have to support their families and their communities the same as us. So having those people have a way to make a living is very important for keeping the biodiversity and the entire like the intactness of the forest, because a lot of the ways that people make a living in those regions are destructive for the environment, but this is a way that it's not. And so just being able to talk to people and like, you know, to realize that most fish keepers have their hearts in the right place, but have never thought about it as being a positive impact on the environment, as making sure that people have ways to support their families. So
That is really cool. You mentioned that especially early on, Project Piaba was involved in a number of studies that really dove deep into the fish industry, especially how it impacts the region in South America. What can you dive a little bit deeper? Tell me a little bit more about the specifics, if you remember. I mean, these studies, I'm sure a little bit on the older side, but what were they finding, like specifically when it comes to these fish, their lifespan, what they're doing with the ecosystem, and how really the wild caught fish that we're harvesting from there is not necessarily as damaging as we thought it would be?
that's a great question, and I will say that our website www.projectpiaba.org has all of the papers and the publications and stuff on it. So if anybody that wants to read this can go look it up. Dr. Chow, who was one of the primary founders of Project Piaba, along with Scott Dowd, was a professor at the University of Amazonas. And he's got a paper that came out in, there was one in the 90s, and then there was one in the early 2000s. And then there's been a lot of papers sort of in between. But basically, the it's a difficult fishery to analyze from a traditional fisheries management point of view. Like so normally if you were going to say, what's the status of codfish, or what's the status of redfish, or what's the status of insert the species of fish, you would do a catch per unit effort study. And that's really, really hard to do in a place where the habitat is as vast as it is and as dynamic as it is in the Rio Negro, right? So it's just this huge expanse of forest that inundates and then recedes annually with different amounts of water every year and different like water levels every year. So it's really hard to go back to exactly the same place and repeat your catch per unit effort. And certain times of the year, it's absolutely unfishable, right? So if you were to go while it's fully inundated, there's 30 feet of water underneath the trees, and you'll never see a cardinal tetra because it's just so. So this is a very seasonal thing. So when the water levels recede, that's when people are catching the fish. And so there's a vast amount of local knowledge of knowing where to find the fish and or how to find the fish, where to find the fish, and what numbers of fish are in these different places. But most of the science is based on the aquarium fishery because it existed for such a long time. So from the 1950s up until today. And those numbers that were coming out of the aquarium fishery in the Rio Negro region were absolutely astronomical in the 1990s all the way up until the early 2000s, or 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008. So the numbers were so high with absolutely no dip. So year after year after year, people were able to harvest those immense numbers of fish. And the only reason that the fish numbers that have been harvested have dipped have been market demand. So it's all a demand related fishery reduction, not a supply related fishery reduction. So based on that, it's pretty easy to prove that the fish populations themselves are quite resilient to overfishing, and in fact, you can't even fish for them during the times of years when the fish are breeding. And all of those fish that are in those puddles, 100% of them that are caught in the flooded forest as the water is receding, 100% of those fish will 100% die if you don't catch them. And so that's not true with every species, like obviously discus and angelfish and some of the longer lived species of fish. That's a slightly different story, but cardinal tetras and a lot of these explosively spawning small species of fish like the tetras, the rummy nose tetras, the hatchet fish, the pencil fish, and all those other cute little guys are just so, explosively spawning that their populations are incredibly resilient to fishing pressure.
So you mentioned a few fish. Obviously you've done a lot of work with the cardinal tetras. Uh, what other fish? You briefly mentioned a few others that are in the same boat. What would you say are the safest wild caught fish in terms of just the resiliency? If you had to pick a top five, like if someone's going to a pet store and the tanks are labeled wild caught, what are the fish where like, hey, don't feel bad. In fact, be positive about the fact that you're buying these wild caught fish because there's no real threat to them going extinct or threatened because of the way that they're harvesting them.
100% cardinal tetras. Those are by and far the safest, best, most amazing choice. I have a list of all of the other. There's 250 other commonly exported species from the Rio Negro that are commonly kept in aquariums, and those are all fish that are pretty with like a similar life history, similar background to cardinal tetras, but they're not as frequently seen in the aquarium hobby. Many of them, some of them are. Some of them are not. But the cardinal tetras, obvious winner. Rummy nose tetras, similar boat, similar life history. All of those pencil fish, things like that. The only ones that I would again be worried about are the fish that you're not going to keep in massive numbers anyway, like the discus, or like there's a lot of press about zebra plecos and plecos that are endangered or threatened due to the aquarium overfishing or habitat degradation. And those fish come from down south. They're from different river systems than where this is, but there are similar fish with similar life histories that are slower growing and might require more thoughtfulness put into their fisheries. So like the freshwater stingrays, anything that has just a few young and lives a long time. But any of those annual spawning fish, like the cardinals, the rummy nose, the hatchet fish, all of those small little fast growers, those fish generally have explosive populations that replace themselves very quickly.
Now we're talking about the Rio Negro. Is can we expand that thought process beyond that region, or do we have to be a little bit more careful when we're looking at other river systems in possibly other countries? It's not basically, they don't all run exactly the same way. Are there other fish in other areas that might be overfished, even though they're on the smaller side? And yeah, they get some flooding, but not as much as what we're seeing in the Rio Negro area.
Yeah, that's a great question. Long story short, yes, it's a repeatable project. It could work in other parts of the world with other fisheries and other species, but this is where we've been working since the 90s. So this is the one that we understand. This is the one that we have the numbers for cardinal tetra harvests for decades and decades and decades. So this is the one that we're sure about. It can apply to any place really that has pretty little fish and not a lot of environmentally friendly ways to make money. But that's the root of it is by people having ways to support their family that doesn't come at the expense of the environment and that is economically linked to protecting it. So it could happen in other places, but this is the one where we've studied it, and it's a bit out of my wheelhouse to say, that this fish somewhere else in the world is also um, you know, is also sustainable when I haven't done the science on it. But these ones, it's definitely, if somebody wants to do a thesis on it, I'm sure you could.
Sure. Have you done any research or looked at any of the potential, besides the environmental aspect? And I know this might be, again, a little side question, any of the potential drawbacks in terms of health of fish when they're wild caught compared to tank raised, aquarium raised, bred somewhere out of that region?
That is an excellent question because this has been one of the biggest challenges to these fish reintroducing themselves into the market. So up until about 2008, they were, wild caught was the only source for cardinal tetras, and then the market started to ramp up in other parts of the world for farm raised fish, and the way that those fish win is by having fish that are bred for aquarium life. They're fed aquarium fish food. They don't have wild parasites. They don't have any of the rigors of the wild. They don't have as much of a supply chain. It's not as long of a supply chain. So a lot of those fish have a lot easier time of it, right? So there's less stress involved at every step of the way. One of the things that Project Piaba has been working on, because we identified this pretty quickly as being one of the ways that the wild fishery is losing the competition against their own biostock, basically, is by trying to make these fish more competitive, right? So they have to be healthy. They have to be ready to live in an aquarium, and they have to be, it's hard to find an ugly cardinal tetra, but they have to be beautiful.
Yeah.
And if they have tattered fins, or if they're emaciated, or if they're unhealthy, they're not beautiful, and they're also not healthy, right? But making those fish healthy is a big step towards making them more competitive in the market. And so one of the things that we've been working on for a long time, actually, probably more than 10 years, is we've been working on best handling practices. And this is one of the things that I'm actually most proud of us having done as an organization is we have worked with people at different parts of the supply chain. So from the fishermen through the intermediaries, through the exporters, to identify points of stress or trauma that could affect the health of the fish later on. And so we have a team of vets that works with us, or that we have a vet who has a team of vets and veterinary students who have gone with them and identified points of stress. So small things like when you handle a fish, like think about this: if you scoop a fish out of your tank and you hold it in the net and it's out of the net and it goes flip flop flip on the net, that's abrasive to that fish, and it degrades the slime coat, and it creates a way for pathogens to get in, right? If the slime coat is degraded, then those tiny abrasions on that fish's body can result in a bacterial infection, not necessarily immediately, but days or weeks down the road, particularly if that fish is compromised in other ways, like stress or poor nutrition or things like that. So making small changes, like when the fish are caught, instead of lifting them out of the net or out of the water in the net, keeping like a little belly of water in the net and scooping them out in a bowl and then moving them into the other vessel that they're going into. So they get scooped in a net, caught by hand in a net. If they get scooped out of the water and then put into the bucket that's in the canoe, then that's a lot more gentle on that fish. And so that's a thing that the fisherman who's catching the fish wouldn't necessarily see a change in the health of the fish, because that's something something that you set in motion that affects that fish weeks down the road after that fish has already been sold and moved through the supply chain. So making small changes like that, and small things like having the food be healthy and fresh. It's really, really, really hard to keep fresh fish food in the jungle. Think about when you open a can of fish food, it gets kind of punky if it's like sitting out in the humidity in your fish room, right? That it doesn't take long for it to get kind of like I wouldn't eat it, right? And the fish will still eat it, but if it's gone bad, if it's gone rancid, it doesn't have the same nutritional impact. So small things like packaging the food in smaller like foil pouches that are, dark, that you can reseal, that aren't going to get wet and soggy, things like that. Having the food be in small batches like that, having the appropriately sized food. A lot of times we've seen people feeding foods that are made for aquaculture, and the things that are aquacultured there are like arapaima, and the food that you would feed an arapaima is not the food that you would feed a cardinal tetra. So it's a different size pellet, it's a different nutritional makeup of the pellet, things like that. So making these minor tweaks to the way that the fish are handled, the way that the fish are fed, and also working with acclimating the fish. So this is a big one too, which we've been working on for a long time, and we've seen some tremendous results, particularly on our last expedition. We just came back from the Amazon, what is it, March 7th? So I have been back for less than a month. But while we were there this time, seeing a lot of the different ways that people are handling the fish at the export facilities and throughout the supply chain has really made for some fat, happy, healthy fish. And so the other thing that I think I just sidetracked myself, but having the fish be acclimated to aquarium tank conditions is another really big one. So in addition to the handling and the food and the stress and stuff like that, also the Rio Negro is a very particular type of water chemistry that's unique in the world. It's very low pH, it's very acidic, it's very soft. And so that water has places where I have personally brought a pH tester and tested the pH, and the lowest number that I've seen has been like 3.8.
Wow,
Yeah,
wow.
that. Most of us don't have our aquariums that low. And in fact, most of these fish that get imported into Florida, if you think about the water in Tampa or Miami, that's like liquid limestone, and it's really hard to have a low pH like that. So acclimating the fish in Brazil has been a game changer for their ability to withstand the stress of travel, and having those fish, and actually, so this is a really cool thing about where most of the export facilities are located. The river water has that very low pH, that it's very acidic, it's very lots of tannins, lots of humic acid, stuff like that, lots of organic materials, makes the water really dark and low pH. But the well water around the city of Manaus has a very low pH when it comes out of the ground, and then it off gases. It's mostly carbonic acid, which gives it its low pH. When it off gases, the pH rises. So the water is very poisonous to fish for like the first day that it comes out of the well. But then once you agitate it and let it off gas that carbonic acid, the pH rises because it's actually very poorly buffered. There's almost no alkalinity to it. So the pH rises, and it gets pretty close to a neutral pH. It gets to be like 6.2, 6.5, which is so much closer to Florida's water and the rest of the world's water than it is when the fish come out of the river. So it makes a difference for bringing those fish up to those more aquarium friendly pHs, and that makes those fish happy, healthy, and able to compete in a global market.
So now here's my question, because we've alluded to it when you were talking about kind of this pathway. Can you take us through stepwise from the time that they're collected to the time that they reach an importer in the United States, approximately what's happening and how much time they're spending at each step in the process?
That is an incredibly complicated question that doesn't really have the same answer every time. So there's really no typical experience for a fish, but it'd be hard to guess how long it takes every time, because there's such a variety in how people fish and where they sell their fish and how they sell their fish and who they sell their fish to. But basically, the fish are collected in the upstream reaches of the Rio Negro around the municipality of Barcelos. So this is like the former like capital of Amazonas and the former aquarium fish capital of the world. So it's this one small city in on the Rio Negro that's about 400 kilometers from Manaus. So people collect the fish in this place, which is huge. It's a huge expanse of forest. They collect the fish and then they accumulate enough of them, and that enough depends on who is fishing, how much money they're trying to make, how many fish they're trying to catch, if they're only fishing for cardinal tetras or if they're fishing for other species as well. So they will catch fish until they have enough, or until somebody orders them, or there's any variety of factors that determine I'm done fishing for now. And so they collect the fish, they hold them in. They have these net pens called viveros, which are basically mosquito net mesh staked down into the shallow water on the edge of the river. So they stake these pens down, they hold the fish in the pens until something happens. So either the person who's buying the fish comes by and buys them, or they accumulate enough to make it worth their while to take them somewhere to sell them. So it's kind of how many fish is that? It depends on the person. It might be 10,000 fish, it might be 100,000 fish, and it really depends on the situation. So those fish get held in these pens, and then they get brought in these plastic. They look kind of like, I don't know if you're familiar with the commercial lobster industry, but like what they sell the lobsters in are like these big plastic totes. They look kind of like that. They're like these. They're only about that deep, like just a couple inches deep, but they stack together, and they will hold about 6 inches of water or so, and they'll put a large number of fish, depending on the species and depending on how they stock them, or how many they caught, or how many bins they want to, how many people they're selling them to. If they're splitting where they're selling them to, or if they're all going to one person, will determine how many fish are put in those tubs. So then they sell those fish. They get on a ferry boat and they go down the river. And this was actually really cool, because on the last expedition, we left a number of our team members to sort of see the whole process, from the fish being caught to the fish making it to the exporters. So we actually kind of we left these guys on a sandbar and said bye, and they took the boat back with the fishermen to return to Barcelos and follow the fish through the supply chain, which was really cool. So stay tuned on our social media to see that footage when we're ready to release it. But that's going to be a while. But it was really cool to see that process from beginning to end. So those fish get on the Recreo, which is a ferry boat, and they take a long, slow ride down to Manaus. And so these ferry boats are sort of they're ferries for people and for goods. So people have their hammocks hanging and they're sleeping on the boat, because that's how they travel. There are roads in the Amazon, but there are not many roads, and most of them don't really go where you want to go. So to get to Barcelos, you either pay an exorbitant amount of money and fly in on a very small, scary plane, or you take a boat. And so all of the freight and most of the people go by boat. So the fish then get brought down to Manaus, and then they go to these export facilities, and then from the export facilities, they are held until they're ordered by somebody, or whatever triggers that process in the supply chain. So if you order a fish and then send somebody out looking for it, that's a different situation than them having a stock list basically of fish. So they all kind of do it differently. And then those fish go through inspections and customs and things like that, and then they get shipped to where they're going. So the thing that I will say is that there's been a lot of governmental bureaucratic problems in the shipment of the fish in the recent year and a half or so. So well, actually, really more than that, probably since the pandemic, because during the pandemic, there were a lot of government offices closed, either due to staffing problems or people losing their jobs, people retiring, health problems, things like that. So a lot of the offices that would inspect international shipments of live fish closed. And so then they started only doing those inspections at only 3 airports in Brazil, and none of them are Manaus. So that's where most of these fish end up. That's where, like, the Barcelos is on the Rio Negro. Manaus is at the confluence of the Rio Negro and the Amazon. So a lot of trade, all of the stuff from the interior of the Amazon basically goes through there. Sao Paulo is about 6 hours away, and that's the airport where the fish have to go through now. And so that is an extra day in the box, right? Because it's 6 hours past. And so having, they can get a state inspection at the airport in Manaus, but then they have to fly someplace really far away to get a federal inspection and be exported. So it makes the supply chain longer. It makes the supply chain more expensive. It adds extra time in the box for the fish, which is not good. But one of the things, though, is that it makes it so much easier for shorter supply chains to compete. So fish coming from other parts of the world, it's a lot easier for them to be exported than it is for the Brazilian fish. So that happened. Also, there was a strike that is very recently over. So then, after only having 3 airports to do all of these international inspections, the people, the government agency that does those inspections went on strike for a lot of the normal reasons why workers go on strike. They wanted better working conditions, they wanted more staff, they wanted better pay. They were basically like, we've got all this work to do, and we feel like we don't have the government resources to do it, so we're on strike. And that that strike was actually resolved very recently, but it has taken a long time for the fishery to catch up, because for a long time fish were not able to get out at all because the inspectors were on strike. So that made it really hard for exporters that didn't have a domestic market in Brazil to compete business wise with any other export facility in any other part of the world. So a lot of people struggled with their businesses at that time, and that meant that a lot of fishermen were not able to make livings in the normal ways. So a lot of people started transitioning out of fishing, and so we've already seen on this past trip when we were down there, a lot of people transitioning into other ways of making a living, and some of those things are kind of are not great. So like I mentioned, the environmentally destructive practices are starting to creep their way in, and it still is like a largely protected area, but it's not as protected as it used to be. So I did see some commercial charcoal production going on, that which is really sad, because if you think about, like, commercial timber harvest, at least you're cutting down the nice big old trees and making something out of them, but charcoal, you're burning it.
Yeah.
But those people still have to make a living. So the real environmental crisis is a lack of livelihoods.
And that's interesting. You said that, and as you're talking, I'm thinking this through. I don't know if you're aware, I import thousands and thousands of fish every 4 to 6 weeks. And particularly the cardinal tetra is an interesting story, because when you talk about the water acclimation thing, and it is absolutely critical that they get that right, because for me in the Chicagoland area, it's hard water, it's a high pH thing. And for the longest time, I didn't even bother with cardinal tetras, rummy nose. I'm like, I can't keep in my water. They just die. Well, I have access to farms all over the world, and some of the farms in Asia, you bring these cardinal tetras in. I'm like, holy cow, I just brought 600 and I lost 2. That's insane. How did that happen? Right. And that part that you mentioned, where if they can get those fish acclimated to water that is, the vast majority of the United States has water that's on the harder side with a pH that's at least neutral or above, at least in terms of the most populated areas. And so if they can get that right, that changes everything. But that also takes time. That's why I asked about the timing of it, when those fish, before they are exported, if they could be collected and then somewhat acclimated to water that is, like you said, closer to neutral, get that GH and KH up a little bit, maybe in the upper single digits, which I know is not easy, but that would save a tremendous, in the long run, it would greatly enhance their business. So I'm glad to hear that they're doing that.
Yeah, that's been a big game changer in the health of the fish,
Yeah.
and also people having the ability to hold them long enough to acclimate them, um, has been a big game changer too, which also benefits their business in ways that hadn't previously been thought about. And this was sort of like an accidental thing, like of, oh, they can't be exported immediately. There's a lot of extra paperwork to catch up on. It takes longer to get the fish inspected and exported because before the inspecting agency went on strike, they went on like a slow strike, like they quiet quit for a while, so they would take like extra
Yeah.
extra time to do the paperwork, which was maddening. um, but at least that's now becoming resolved. But having the fish have longer at the exporters actually resulted in healthier fish, because that was more rest time, and as long as those fish are being fed high quality foods while they're being rested, they're having a great time because they're just getting fat and healthy. And you can sell a bigger cardinal. Like, there's a big price difference between a medium and a jumbo. um,
Absolutely.
and when you see them in a tank beside each other, you're like, whoa.
So you had mentioned a couple times that it could be a disaster if someone were to come along with a magic wand and maybe just they just don't know, they're ignorant to everything we've discussed so far, and said, hey, no more wild caught fish, this is bad, we can farm raise them now, we're not doing this anymore. To the best of your ability, describe what would happen in that region, the Rio Negro, just economically, and how does that actually impact the environment?
It would be a catastrophe. There's no other way to put it, because there are 3.8 million people who live in the state of Amazonas that all have families and lives, and deserve the same, you know, deserve to be able to support their families the same way that anyone else in the world does. And to suddenly take away the one of the most one of the biggest ways of making a living in that region. So in within Barcelos, um, at like as recently as 10 years ago, 60% of the income of that municipality was made from aquarium fishing. So if you yank that rug out from under people, all those people need a way to support their families all of a sudden. And so there's other industries that people could make a living at. Most of them are destructive for the environment. Now, a lot of people are sort of transitioning into sport fishing. So peacock bass is angling, is one way that people are making a living, and there's a lot of money in it in the short term for people. I don't know how sustainable it is in the long run. I don't know how it's also almost colonial in the way that it's being done, where people who have like the sport fishing enterprises are making a lot of money, and people who are living there are doing a lot of work. And so it's sort of is not it's not as it's my own business type of business as aquarium fishing is. But so that's one thing. Also, there's a lot of like stocking of fish that's happening without a lot of environmental impact study type stuff. Like here we have, when you stock fish, there's a lot of care and thought that goes into like where they're like biosecurity measures and things like that. In this case, people might be just dumping buckets of fish places to improve the sport fishing later without a whole lot of oversight into how that's happening. So that's just kind of a high altitude thought on that. Again, there's the commercial charcoal. A lot of people are migrating to urban areas, which is kind of a like the people who originally lived in more rural reaches of the Amazon are going into those city areas, and all of a sudden have to pay for everything in their life. So instead of having fish from the river and water from the river and their whole, like, everything being supported from the environment is now being purchased, and there's a lot of poverty issues, and all of the bad things that come along with that. There's a lot of, it's scary to think about, like, because you think about the rest of the Amazon, and you see like cattle ranching and slash and burn farming and timber harvest and all of those things, and you see it like taking a slow march through the Amazon like that, and it's really kind of scary to think about, because this is such a, like the Rio Negro region has been so protected for so long. It's close to perfect, unlike most of the rest of the Amazon. And so to have people suddenly be looking for other ways to make a living is disastrous, and especially for that to be, based on outside factors of somebody somebody saying no more fish, is really kind of is my reaction to it.
Well, and as you're talking, you're bringing up in my head, I talk about ecosystems and stuff in my biology classes, and we discuss things like apex predators, and you can potentially have a much bigger impact on an ecosystem when you start eliminating those. And the peacock bass is, I don't know if it's necessarily the apex predator, because you've got arapaima, you got some really large fish in those systems, but you're getting up there. By the time you start decreasing the peacock bass and those larger game fish, you have a significant impact on the biodiversity in those river systems because of that, right? So then you've got the slash and burn issue, where a lot of people think, okay, you can just replant the trees and everything's going to be fine. No, most of the nutrients are actually up in the trees. They're not in the soil. And so once you slash and burn, if it's for agriculture, you're going to get a few years, but every single year you're going to get less and less crops until you completely deplete the soil. And now it's trash, it's garbage. And are you seeing any issues in that region like they saw in Lake Victoria, when they did a lot of deforestation around the lake, and then you had a ton of runoff, and that made the situation almost impossible for a lot of the fish to breed there? Now it's a little different in South America, but has any of that happened at all, to the best of your knowledge?
Yeah, well, that's one of the things. So this, the slash and burn, anything that deforests is bad news for any of these fish, because they rely on the flooded forest. So taking removing the habitat in that way is bad for them, because that they depend on, like, there's not a lot of, most of the inputs, most of the carbon that's in this river, most of the food sources that make their way through the food chain in the Rio Negro are all brought in by the forest. They're not of the river itself. It's a generally nutrient poor river. But the things that do feed the fish are, the nuts, the berries, the bugs, the trees, the things that fall out of the forest during the high water season. So that is very important to the fish, both in terms of habitat and in terms of resources. But also, all of these species of fish, any of us as fish keepers understand that you can't mistreat a cardinal tetra and expect it to survive. They're fairly sensitive fish. So even having this stuff happening upstream of where you fish is bad news for your fish. So there aren't a lot of ranches and stuff now, but there are some. And where those exist, it's kind of like a muddy riverbank nightmare. And so there's not fishing happening downstream of those. So the people who are fishing still prevent those things from happening near them, because they understand that it makes their way of making a living harder. So it's sort of like a, think about it as being like the ultimate HOA, or the ultimate, like, not in my backyard type people saying, oh, you can't do that here because that's, I fish. And in this case, it's a really good thing, because it's driving a lot of community level stewardship in ways that have to be economically motivated to really get people to do it. Like the habitat is too vast to think about the government protecting it, or even a non-government agency, right? It's too big. There's too many people spread out too far to actually have, like, environmental regulations be effective. It has to come from a community level of people who are invested in it themselves, and that makes it more likely to be successful anyway. So the people policing the environment, because it's their way of making a living and it's their culture as well, is very important, and that's what makes it successful. But if you remove that way of making a living, people still gotta eat, still gotta feed the kids, still gotta be able to buy medicine or clothes and things like that. And so it can lead to environmental disaster pretty quick.
Yeah, and the other thing to consider as well, and that is when you do slash and burn farming, basically slash and burn farming, and your crops are starting to suffer. Well, what's the solution to that? Let's dump some nutrients into the soil. And where do those nutrients wind up, especially in the rainy seasons? Right in the waterways. And when you have water that is very, very soft, already has a low pH, in some ways that water is less resistant to environmental input than water that's got a really high KH and GH and a really high pH. That water can sometimes withstand the addition of sulfates and nitrates and ammonia. That softer water with that low pH can really be impacted. I know it's a river system, it's not a lake, but it's still a pretty dangerous thing.
Yeah, for sure.
So would love for our viewers, for our listeners, we've talked a lot about all of the benefits of wild caught fish, some things to consider, but how, if they want to be helpful, if they want to support what you're doing at Project Piaba, how do they do that?
I'm so glad you asked. So the best thing that people can do is care about where your fish come from. So a lot of times people have this drive to be environmentally minded and to do the right thing for the environment. But a lot of times it gets kind of tired. Like what you hear people suggest is like, turn out the lights when you leave the room, don't waste water, carpool, things like that. You get kind of tired of hearing about it. But your aquarium and how you spend your money on your fish is directly related to the conservation of these biologically sensitive areas in the forests of the Rio Negro region of the Amazon. And it's not a small number either, right? When you think about climate change and carbon sequestration and things like that, the area that is protected by the fishery in the municipality of Barcelos is about 46,000 square miles of tropical rainforest, and that protects 7.6 billion metric tons of carbon. And the aquarium fish industry is writing the checks that are going into the pockets of the people that are protecting that forest. And it's more money than any NGO or any governmental agency could write to protect that region, right? So what we are doing as fish keepers by buying these fish year after year after year and insisting on these fish as being, the environmental protectors that they are. When you care about where your fish comes from and when you insist on the fish that has the positive environmental impact, you are writing your check to protect the rainforest, and you're directly connected to it as well. So that's the biggest thing that you can do. And so a lot of times it can be kind of hard to know the difference, right? Like, so we're sort of trained to think about like fair trade coffee and chocolate and things like that, and the way that we spend our money, how that impacts the environment in those ways. But it's sort of counterintuitive to think about it from the point of view of your fish tank. And so to sort of put that spin on it is really the biggest thing that you can do. And if you can't find a place that sells the wild caught fish, it's good to have a conversation with the people that, or with the places where you buy your fish, and be like, well, why not? And in the case of like the last year or so, where it's been sort of hard to actually export those fish out of Brazil, there's been a reason. But now that those numbers are starting to pick back up, and that it's getting easier to export fish out of Brazil again, and there's going to be more fish that are healthier and well fed and things like that, it's really important for people to go the extra step and talk to the people who own the fish stores and say, hey, where do you buy your fish from, and why? Can you buy these ones? And that really makes a big difference. There's also like our organization. So Project Piaba is a nonprofit. We are fully staffed by volunteers. So I don't make any money doing this. And so donations are always gratefully accepted. That's all on our website. We are actively searching for. We have a grant for a grant writer. that we're looking for. So if anybody has those particular talents, we're always looking for somebody to help us write grants for projects and funding and stuff like that. So there are so many ways to be involved in this, but the biggest one is to be aware of it, and particularly if you like I said, I will talk about fish to anyone who will listen. And so when I walk into a fish store and somebody's like, oh, well, I like these ones because they're farm raised, I'll be like, well, have you thought about this totally counterintuitive story that is actually really important for the environment and has the capacity to literally save the rainforest, which is the thing that my generation has always been like, save the rainforest. And it's like, you actually can. It's not a momentous task. It's, you're actually writing checks every day that can. So.
That's awesome. So you mentioned social media. I know you mentioned it partway through, but just once again, where can people find you? Social media, website, give us all that information. Of course, we'll put it in the description of the podcast as well.
Yeah, sure. We're projectpiaba.org. So we have a website. It's projectpiaba.org. We have a YouTube channel. I put up I do a Wild Fish Friday. So every Friday I put up a video of wild fish in wild habitat, and they're not. Don't come for me expecting National Geographic. It's not it's not beautifully published, but it's authentic videos of fish swimming around in their natural habitat. So that's particularly valuable for people who are trying to do a biotope or who want to see how their fish interact with the environment in the wild. So it's really fascinating. Actually, the one that I published like 12 hours ago was there was this shoal of January tetras, which are a fish that I've only seen in a fish store once. And this, like last month, saw a shoal that had to have been 1,000 of them easily, and they were just like swimming around me in a circle. And I just took a video. I was like, it might make you dizzy, but I just took a video of them like going around, and it was like, whoa. So anyway, there's that. If you like fish, have I got the social media channels for you? So we also do Instagram, Facebook, and I think those are it. I haven't figured out TikTok yet. But maybe
it's the same as Instagram.
Is it?
Yeah, just a different crowd. Well, that's awesome. Well, we're coming up right on that hour, John. I don't know if you've got anything you want to add, but I want to be respectful of your time because I know you're busy. You've had a long day, and you're speaking to us after work. So really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. It's been eye-opening. It's been very enlightening. And I hope everybody who listened and watched this podcast, maybe you learned something. Maybe you have a different perspective on things now, but really appreciate you being here.
Yes,
Yeah,
thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I'm always happy to talk fish.
Awesome. Well, I, again, really appreciate it. Everybody, if you want to learn more, I can't stress enough, go to the description of this podcast, projectpiaba.org. Some really cool stuff. So you might have heard like a little bit of audio come through there like a minute ago. As you were mentioning your YouTube channel, I'm like, oh yeah, there's some pretty cool things here. So check it out. Project Piaba on YouTube, and check out the website. So thank you for being here, and have a great weekend.
Thanks. You too.